Photoshop CS5 has a brand new feature brought in for manipulating images. And the core elements of this feature come from Photoshop's sister animation program, After Effects. If you're an After Effects user, you're probably familiar with the Puppet command. Those core features have been brought into Photoshop and built into a new command called Puppet Warp. What we're going to do in this movie is take a look at how we can use the Puppet Warp command to manipulate images, and then in the next movie, once we're comfortable with all the different features and options associated with the command, we'll apply it to a more real-world situation. So right now I have a document called puppet.psd, and this is available in your resources folder. We have a layer called Sky, and on this layer we have a man jumping. What we want to do is we want to isolate this man from the sky. In order for us to do that, we're going to use the Quick Selection tool. Now, if you were working on your own project, you'd probably spend a lot of time creating a precise selection, but for demonstration purposes, it doesn't really matter so much, so we're going to make a crude but fairly decent selection of this guy. So I'm going to go ahead and click and drag around his legs, and now, for the most part, he's selected. There's some additional sky pixels here, so if you really wanted to, you could hold down the Alt or Option key on the Mac and just click underneath his arm to clean that up a little bit. And you could do the same thing here by his finger on his wrist. So that, quite frankly, is going to be good enough for this example. What I want to do is I want to save this selection, so come up to the Select menu, and under the Select menu, you can choose Save Selection. This will open up the Save Selection dialog box. What we want to do is save this as a new channel, and I'm going to call this Guy. Go ahead and click OK. And now we save that selection. What I now want to do is I want to move this guy up onto his own layer. In order for us to do that, we're going to use the keyboard shortcut. On the Macintosh, it's Command-Option-J. On a Windows machine, it's going to be Control-Alt-J. And that opens up the new layer dialog box. We'll go ahead and call this Man. Go ahead and click OK. Once you click OK, you'll notice the man is now on his own layer. Problem is, though, if we turn off the visibility of the man layer, he still exists on the sky layer, and we don't really want that. If we manipulate the man, we don't want to see him, or this duplicate, underneath him. So what we need to do is we need to remove him from the sky layer. So come over and highlight the sky layer. With the sky layer selected, let's come up to the Select menu and choose Load Selection. And in this case, we want to go ahead and load the guy channel. Go ahead and click OK. It rebuilds our selection, places it on top of the guy. But in this case, you'll notice if we get really picky, we are missing some pixels. There's some black here from his sneaker that's in the sky. We want to make sure that we have everything selected from this guy. So what I'd like you to do is come up to the Select menu, and under the Select menu, you can choose Modify, then you can choose Expand. And what we want to do is expand this selection, and by 5 pixels should probably be adequate. So go ahead and click OK. Once you click OK, the selection is expanded. At this point, again with the sky layer selected, we can fill this selection with the content of the sky. If you're watching the previous movies in this title, you're aware that there's something called Content Aware Fill, and that's exactly what we're going to use to fill this area with the sky. So let's come up to the Edit menu again, and we're going to go ahead and choose Fill. When you choose Fill, it's going to open up the Fill dialog box. The contents, we want to use Content Aware. Go ahead and click OK. Once you click OK, it's going to take the pixels from the sky and place it where the guy was. Go ahead and deselect. It's Command-D or Control-D on Windows. Now, looking at it, it's not perfect. You can actually see kind of like a pattern of the guy's leg. You could use the spot healing brush to kind of clean that up a little bit. But for our purposes right now, it's fine. Remember, we're going to be looking at this guy, so we're not going to see too much of those imperfections in the sky. With that being said, the last thing that I want to do, which isn't a requirement of the Puppet Warp command, but I want to convert this into a smart object. By doing that, we preserve the original image's pixels, so if we ever need to return to it or turn off the Puppet Warp command that we have applied to the smart object, we would have that ability. So go ahead and right-click or control-click on the man layer, And in the contextual menu, you can choose Convert to Smart Object. So now this guy is in essentially a protective container. And we're now ready to manipulate him using the Puppet Warp command. So we want to come up to the Edit menu. And again, make sure that the man layer is the active layer. Then you can come up to the Edit menu and you can choose Puppet Warp. Now, the idea of Puppet Warp is setting pins within the image. Then you can manipulate the content in between those pins to warp and distort the graphic. So before we start adding those pins, a couple things I want to point out. The first thing that we want to look at is the mesh. So in the options bar, go ahead and select Show Mesh. And what this is doing is showing you the triangular pattern that you're going to be able to manipulate by adding pins to the image. Now, if you want to get some pins very close to one another, you may not be able to do that with this default mesh. You may have to come over to the density option and change it to more points. When you do that, you'll notice the mesh tightens up, there's more triangles, which in turn means you're going to be allowed to place more pins on this image. And of course, fewer pins does the opposite. Let's go ahead and leave it set to the default of normal. You can also expand the mesh beyond your element on the layer. Now, I want to point out that if we had more than one object on the man layer, let's say we had some clouds, as long as those clouds weren't touching the man, they would be treated as separate meshes, which means you'd be able to manipulate them separately from the man. I just want to let you know that that is a feature of the Puppet Warp command. But you can expand the mesh beyond the guy. So now we would be manipulating not only the guy, but also the content outside of the guy that's inside this mesh. Or you could also decrease it, which means you would be manipulating a little less of the guy until he almost disappears. But we want to go ahead and keep this set to 2 pixels, which is the default. So we'll go ahead and drag the slider to 2, or if you're having trouble, just type 2 in that text field. So that's the mesh that we're going to be working with when we set these pins. So let's go ahead and set some pins. In order for us to set the pins, though, I don't want to look at the mesh. You certainly can, but in this case, I don't. So I'm going to go ahead and toggle that off. Now, to set a pin, all you have to do is click in the image. So I'm going to go ahead and click once here on his shoulder, and I'll click again here on his elbow. What this means right now, if I were to click and drag this pin, I'm going to change the pixels in between the 2 pins. Also notice the first pin is going to act as a pivot point. So these pins eventually will act also as anchors. Let's say, for example, we didn't want him to rotate. Well, what you could do is set more pins. And as you set more pins, these pins will behave as anchors when you go to manipulate one of those pin points. So you can see he's moving around quite a bit less. He's anchored down essentially across his chest. If you want to manipulate 2 pins at the same time, simply hold down the Shift key and select the second pin, then click and drag, and now you're manipulating the 2 pins together. If you want to remove a pin, you can do that. Hold down the Alt key on Windows, the Option key on the Mac. When you place your cursor on top of a pin, you'll get a little pair of scissors, which means if you click, you're going to remove it. And when you remove the pin, you'll notice that the image starts going back to its original position. If you have so many pins and you've distorted the image beyond recognition and you want to start over, you can go ahead and click this button right here in the options bar, which is going to remove all pins, setting it back to its original state. So let's go ahead and add just a couple more pins here and manipulate this guy a bit further. I'm just going to set up a bunch of different pins across his arms, maybe one here on his belly, on his thighs, on his knees, and maybe on his ankles. So here we could drag out his legs a little bit, and you probably want to make sure you maintain proportions. Of course, it's going to be out of proportion of reality, but if we drag out his calf, we should also drag out his thigh a little bit, and we'll do the same thing with his arms. So this really gives us the ability to kind of change the appearance of original artwork to better suit the needs of your project. We can even bring this guy's waist in a little bit and make him a little bit skinnier. Not that he was overweight or anything, but you have that ability now with the Puppet Warp command. One other thing I'd like to point out is if you hold down the Alt or Option key and mouse over one of these pins, you'll notice you get a pair of scissors. However, if you mouse out, you'll notice, well, right now, here's my selected pin, so sorry, I wasn't really paying attention. You'll get a pair of scissors, but if you mouse out, you'll get a rotation pin. So I don't want to manipulate this one, so I'm going to come over and highlight this pin. If I hold down that Alt or Option key, I'll get this rotation bounding area, which I can click and drag to rotate the shape with. So once you're happy with manipulating the object, you can apply the puppet warp by clicking the checkbox in the options bar. When you do, the puppet warp has been applied, but notice it's a smart object. So if you wanted to, you could temporarily turn off the visibility of the puppet warp to go back to the original, and you can turn it back on. And because it's a smart filter, this is essentially a mask. So if you wanted to, you could paint with black on this mask, revealing the original image. I don't necessarily want to do that. But the final thing about this, which is great, if you double-click Puppet Warp, you're returned back to the Puppet Warp, and you can manipulate any one of these pins again. The last thing that I want to show you is how you can temporarily turn off the visibility of the pins. You can do that on a Macintosh by holding down the Control key and pressing H. It would be a right-click and an H on Windows. So using the Puppet Warp command in conjunction with a smart object gives you the ability to come back in and re-edit the Puppet Warp, which you wouldn't otherwise have the ability to do. So I'm going to go ahead and accept these changes again. And now in the next movie, we'll look at a more practical application for using the Puppet Warp command.